Are we gonna see the games or what? Show us!
Welcome back to DF Retro's exploration of the Sega 32X. This time we're finishing off the library with games like Doom, Shadow Squadron, WWF WrestleMania the arcade game, and those precious few 32X games that shipped on CD. If you're looking for platform games, racing games, or Fred couples though, that's back in part 1. We're also taking a look at 3 unfinished prototypes that were in production for the 32X before its untimely demise. All that and more on this episode of DF Retro. Let's get to it. Before we jump into released games, I thought it would be interesting to delve into a few prototypes, games that were being worked on but ultimately never released. After all, the 32X was only on shelves for a short time, and we never really got to see what many developers could do with the hardware. One of the most impressive efforts then is X-Men Mind Games. This unreleased game was shown at E3 1995, but years later a prototype was leaked, allowing us to take a closer look. The game was in development by Scavenger, a short-lived publisher with studios around the world, including Xerix and Lemon. While it's not clear which team was working on X-Men per se, both Xerix and Lemon had roots in the demo scene and worked together to help produce this rather impressive 32X tech demo, which really showcases what might have been. Xerix had already proven itself previously with the mighty impressive Red Zone back on the Mega Drive, which did all sorts of interesting things with the hardware. X-Men itself is a curious one then. It's a game that uses 3D environments with sprites, giving the world a sort of depth. The prototype doesn't play especially well, of course, but the idea is interesting and there was some potential here. The environments feature plenty of texture detail, and it's clear that the engine was quite capable. It runs a lot faster than some of the other textured 3D games in the 32X. Had the 32X stuck around for a little longer then, this is a game that could very well have been released. Then we have Virtua Hamster, which is a super strange concept that involves running a hamster through a series of tubes. The demo is highly unpolished and early, but showcases stable 3D flat-shaded rendering at a smooth frame rate. I'm not sure a hamster simulator was the best idea for such a niche platform though. Another more interesting one is Soulstar X, a conversion of the Sega CD game from Core Design. Core was also responsible for last episode's awful BC Racers, but Soulstar X looks promising with improved visuals over the Sega CD original and smoother performance than BC Racers. This was also being developed for the Atari Jaguar around the same time. Of course, these are just 3 interesting titles out there, but there were reportedly a lot more 32X games in development at one point. Castlevania Symphony of the Night, for instance, started out on the 32X in some form, often going by the title Bloodletting. But when the 32X started to fail, Konami shifted focus over to the PlayStation instead. Sega even had a Sonic game in development for the system that would feature 3D graphics. Probably better that it was never released though. Clearly, with such a poor reception then, the 32X was never realistically going to receive much support. Its death was imminent just after launch, and we're left with just 40 commercially released games, which we're gonna finish covering right now. Nothing shows off the prowess of a new system quite like a space shooter, and the 32X has 5 of them, so let's start there. From the impressive Shadow Squadron, system-pushing Darkside, and the unique Zaxxon's Mother Base 2000, the 32X has you covered. You must remember that this genre was huge back in the mid-90s. The PC was all about space games like Wing Commander and TIE Fighter, so it's no surprise that the 32X has a lot of games focused on this theme. To kick off, let's start with my favorite of the bunch, Shadow Squadron, also known as Stellar Assault in Japan. This is an interesting take on the space sim genre that showcases some of the smoothest visuals on the 32X. It was developed by Sega CS with mechanical designs provided by the design studio Artmic. As a result, the game shares design elements with the OVA Gull Force. Once you jump into the game itself then, Shadow Squadron begins with an impressive launch sequence that sees your ship smoothly lock into position prior to launching. A system check pops up, and once complete, you're blasted out into space. Shadow Squadron does a great job of showcasing what the 32X can do. While it focuses on flat shaded polygons, the models are all reasonably complex and the frame rate is surprisingly stable. Shadow Squadron is also one of the only games to make use of the 32X's 15-bit RGB direct color mode. The reason for this is simple. Most games on the system rely on a 256 color palletized mode as a result of memory limitations. Each of the two available frame buffers feature just 128 kilobytes of memory, making it difficult to fit a complete 15-bit frame in there. To work around this then, Shadow Squadron uses a resolution of 288 by 224, which is surrounded by a black frame. The larger color palette allows for smoother shading with less visible dithering across many 3D objects. There is still some minor dithering present of course, but overall it's one of the cleanest looking 3D games on the system. We also see some clever tricks in use here. The sun and laser blasts, for instance, rapidly cycle colors 60 times per second, even though the game only updates its 3D polygons at 20 frames per second. This makes it tricky to analyze the frame rate then, as color cycling interferes with the frame counting. Still, through some strategic clipping and trying to avoid looking at the sun, well, it's actually possible to see that the game does indeed operate at just 20 frames per second, with some wobbliness here and there. Okay, so the 3D looks excellent and the game plays relatively smoothly, but how does Shadow Squadron exploit the Mega Drive hardware? Simple, the cockpit overlay. The 60 FPS status check and mission briefings are all handled by the 16-bit hardware. If you remove the Mega Drive layer though, the 32X then handles all of the 3D objects in the scene, including the color cycling applied to select surfaces. The audio unfortunately only makes limited use of the PWM capabilities of the 32X. Take a listen. Yep, it's just a basic melody and part of the percussion. Everything else is played back using the Mega Drive's Yamaha chip. Still, taken as a whole, Shadow Squadron is easily one of the most impressive games on the 32X and also one of the best playing. Believe it or not, it even received a sequel of sorts on the Sega Saturn known as Stellar Assault SS. This was created by a different developer, however, and is also extremely rare at this point, but it's kind of worth checking out. Of the two though, I prefer the 32X original, and it's one of the games that you have to own for the system if you have a 32X. Another impressive looking game then is Darkside. This cart is one of the less common 32X games and also only available in PAL regions. It's a 3D take on asteroids and just happens to stand out as one of the only 32X games to feature fully textured polygons and primitive lighting. Displaying fully texture-mapped polygons in this fashion is a real challenge for the system, as the simplistic video display processor offers zero support for even the simplest 3D affine line rendering. Everything here is written in assembly code for the dual SH2s, enabling the game to draw texture maps on its polygons. In terms of 3D performance though, the 32X isn't that far off from what you'd get using a mid-range 486 PC back in the day, which is to say, it isn't well suited to rendering 3D at high frame rates. So as impressive as these results may seem, it also kind of demonstrates why flat shaded polygons are ultimately a better fit for the platform. The severe texture warping is certainly bothersome, yet expected, but the performance is the real problem here. Darkside runs at an obscenely low frame rate when objects are in close proximity to the camera. It picks up somewhat during normal gameplay, but it never feels anywhere near as fluid as Shadow Squadron. So, as such an advanced title then, how does Darkside make use of the Mega Drive? Well, like this. Yep, it doesn't use the Mega Drive at all for any visual rendering. The 32X handles 100% of the visuals on display here. That's kind of neat, right? Of course, the Mega Drive's Yamaha audio chip is used in combination with the 32X PWM capabilities, and the results are generally pretty good here. Overall, Darkside stands out as one of the most impressive technical feats on the 32X, displaying visuals that seem impossible for the platform. And to a degree, that's completely accurate, as the frame rate is so low, it almost was impossible. Due to the high cost of the cartridge then, this is one that I cannot recommend seeking out. The next game though is quite different from the previous two titles, Zaxxon's Mother Base 2000. It shares a spiritual connection with the original Zaxxon, but ultimately plays nothing like it.
This is an original isometric game that focuses on taking control of different craft as you blast your way through an isometric environment. Technically speaking, it's an interesting mix. All moving objects within the world are constructed from flat shaded polygons, enabling a sense of depth that the original Zaxxon was lacking. Despite the low polygon count, the designers at CSK managed to deliver some unique looking enemy ships that animate smoothly while throwing a huge number of them around the screen. This also enables some rather large boss battles with creative ways to defeat them. The background graphics then are entirely two-dimensional and make use of the system's expanded color palette. This means smoother color gradients that more closely match the source renders. While it's difficult to be certain, Mother Base 2000 might be one of the few games using the 32X's higher color modes similar to Shadow Squadron, as the resolution of the playfield does not fill the screen. The rest of the image is made up by the status bar and parallax background behind the isometric playfield, both of which are handled by the Mega Drive hardware. The game plays well, but unfortunately the frame rate is a little too low for a shooter like this. This is one title that would really benefit from a 60 frames per second update. Still, despite those issues, in many ways, Zaxxon's Mother Base 2000 is one of the more interesting games for the 32X. It's a fun little shooter with unique mechanics and a solid visual style. Definitely worth a look. Next up is Star Wars Arcade, one of the most hyped releases for the system. Based on the 1993 Model 1 arcade game, Star Wars Arcade is basically a simplified space shooter. Unlike the previous two titles, players are limited to maneuvering within a specific area, making it more difficult to engage with enemies. While the game itself isn't particularly brilliant, the visuals on display are among the most impressive for the system in many ways. Similar to Shadow Squadron, Star Wars uses flat shaded polygons to represent ships and scenery. As this is based on a Model 1 arcade game then, it's likely that the game was programmed to use quads, though without dedicated 3D hardware, the 32X is certainly capable of triangles as well, something not possible on the Model 1 or the Sega Saturn. What stands out about Star Wars then is the Death Star approach. Players can fly down and around the surface of the Death Star in real 3D. The clipping distance is limited, resulting in noticeable pop-ins, sure, but for the time this was an impressive display of real 3D that exceeds many comparable spaceflight games. Unfortunately, performance can dip to unacceptable levels during these sections, making it more difficult to play, which is a real problem as the game itself is rather tough. Performance analysis is also difficult with this one. The game updates various parts of the image at variable intervals. The 3D polygons might update first, followed by one set of particles, then another set before updating the 3D again. Based on this pattern, the primary 3D visuals then update at 20 frames per second. And that's just for this part. When you're out in space, the game updates closer to 30 frames per second. And when things get really busy, it can drop below 20 frames per second. So we're really looking at an incredibly variable level of performance here. As for the Mega Drive utilization, Sega's 16-bit machine is used to display the cockpit overlay, specific particles designed to give the impression of speed, and of course, Admiral Akbar.
Stand by to receive orders.
Audio is limited as well. The PWM capabilities of the 32X handle many of the sound effects and speech, but all of the music, aside from the introductory piece, is handled by the Mega Drive's Yamaha chip, and doesn't sound great. It's not a bad effort overall though, and it's one of the only Sega Star Wars games to receive a proper home conversion. If you owned a 32X back in the day, this was probably one of the games you had in your collection. The last of the space-related games then is none other than Star Trek Starfleet Academy, Starship Bridge Simulator, a port of the Super NES game by the very same name. Brought to you by Interplay and High Voltage Software, Bridge Simulator on 32X makes surprisingly good use of the hardware. The space action itself is rendered using simplistic 3D polygons, but the 2D backgrounds used throughout the game are lavish with detail and rich with color. Compared to the Super NES original, it's a nice upgrade with smoother color gradients and more color detail throughout. The 3D scenes are of course also rendered at higher quality on 32X, though the frame rate is rather low in both versions. All of the areas outside of your ship have been redrawn as well compared to the Super NES version. So while it is a very similar game, the look and feel has been enhanced greatly here and it works quite well on Sega's little system. The audio is another area where the 32X version excels. By combining the Yamaha YM2612, which handles this portion of the melody, with the PWM capabilities of the 32X, which sounds like this. High Voltage software delivers a rousing rendition of the classic music. It's a nice step up from the muffled Super NES version. The Mega Drive usage is also rather clever. The 16-bit machine is responsible exclusively for the flashing lights used on the deck. That's it, simple color cycling. And it works pretty well. Ultimately though, there isn't a lot more to say about this one. It's a solid conversion of the Super NES game that improves upon its original release in every way. Well done, High Voltage. And with that, we've covered all of the space combat games available on 32X. So let's move on to the next genre. Now we're talking. Doom was one of the hottest games of its era, and getting a competent console conversion of the game became an arms race of sorts. Doom has been released on a huge number of consoles, but the 32X version is one of the very first made available. So is it any good? Well, yes and no. The 32X version is presented in a small window with a significant border around it. The colors are limited, with lots of visible streaking present throughout the game. Many of the animations are missing, and sprites are only stored facing the camera, making it impossible to sneak up on foes. On top of that, only the first 2 episodes are included here, and not even every map is present, plus they've all been simplified. Lastly, the music was absolutely destroyed, with low-quality Yamaha synth versions of the original tunes spoiling the atmosphere. That doesn't sound great, right? Well, it's partially made up by the fact that this is Doom, and it runs smoothly. Compared to other conversions at the time, the 32X version is one of the fastest available, with a smooth frame rate and solid control. Simply put, it plays just as you would hope, and that makes it a decent overall conversion. John Carmack himself ported the game to 32X, and the code is based on the Atari Jaguar version, which John was also working on. Doom was sold as one of the main reasons to get a 32X back in the day. PCs were still quite expensive at the time, and a console conversion was the most cost-effective way to enjoy the game.
For those wondering, here's how Doom makes use of the Mega Drive hardware. Just the status bar. Everything else is handled by the 32X. It's just a shame that they didn't make better use of the 32X's audio capabilities.
Oh, and if you're looking for more Doom, don't worry, it's coming. But as for the 32X, that's it. Doom is the only official first-person shooter available on the system. There's other first-person games, of course, but nothing else quite like Doom. So let's move on to the next genre then. And now it's time for the main event. That's right, there's 2 wrestling games in the 32X, but only one of them can emerge the victor. On one side we have WWF WrestleMania the arcade game, on the other, WWF Raw. Let's start with the best there ever will be, WrestleMania the arcade game, possibly the greatest wrestling game of all time. Released by Midway during its digitized sprites craze, WrestleMania the arcade game is all about fast fighting action in the ring. It plays more like a fighting game than a typical wrestling title, and as a result, it's a ton of fun. The Sega 32X version was ported by just 2 people and strives to deliver visuals closer to the arcade game. At a glance then, it's still a ways off from the large sprites of the original arcade, but it looks reasonably nice. It's only when you pull in the original Mega Drive version that the improvements become evident. The 16-bit version uses the system's lower resolution mode and simply lacks the colors necessary to deliver the artwork. The 32X in comparison offers a much higher color palette and more detailed sprites. Unfortunately, this comes at a cost. The frame rate is dropped to just 30 frames per second on 32X versus the silky smooth 60 FPS of the Mega Drive game. After last episode, this should come as no surprise then, as the 32X is rather sluggish when handling 2D bitmaps due to the lack of tile and sprite acceleration. So how about the Super NES version? This one features a higher color palette than the Mega Drive, but still falls short of 32X. It's also lacking 2 of the characters and features plenty of slowdown, especially when 3 characters are on screen, even though the base frame rate is 60 FPS. So how does this game make use of the Mega Drive? Well, it offloads part of the background of the 16-bit machine. It's interesting to see just how closely linked the hardware is in this title, so while the Mega Drive could probably have handled the backgrounds at 60 FPS without a problem, it wouldn't have lined up properly with the 30 FPS sprites on 32X. Still, considering that just 2 people worked on this project, the results aren't really bad, and the game itself is amazing. So what about WWF Raw? Well, here's all you need to know. Yes, it still has Bret the Hitman Hart, but aside from that, Raw is not war, it's just lame. It looks poor compared to the arcade game with grainy artwork all over, the animation isn't great, and it feels terrible to play. Yeah, it's an improvement over the Genesis game visually, but once again, the frame rate is lower on 32X, and the jump in visual quality is relatively minor. This is still an ugly game no matter where you play it. This is kind of all you need to know when playing Raw. This game sucks. If you want a wrestling game on 32X, then you know what to do.
Bring it on, bring it on, bring it on. What you gonna get? Gonna get respect. What you gotta get? Gotta get respect. What you wanna get? Wanna get respect. So how
Okay, now things are about to get crazy. There are 6 games available that take advantage of both the 32X and the Mega CD, and one of them is almost non-existent, as we'll see in a moment. From what I understand, the most significant limitation with this Mega CD/32X setup is the lack of available system memory on the 32X. With cartridge-based games, the included memory in the cart works in tandem with the system and video memory, but when playing a game from the CD, the game only really has access to 256 kilobytes of memory on the 32X side. Aside from the limited market potential then, this might help explain why these sorts of games were so uncommon. As a result of this, these CD32X games focused entirely on full motion video, with the 32X essentially acting as a video decoder. This allows for larger video with an expanded color palette compared to the ultra-limited Mega CD.
Let's start with the best of the lot then, Night Trap. This controversial game focuses on security system management as players flick through security cameras in order to trap vampiric augurs wandering around the house. It's a strange game, and on CD32X, it's also greatly improved. The main difference is, of course, the improved video playback. The frame rate is identical between the 2 versions at 15 frames per second, but the color palette is massively increased on 32X. It's a huge step up in terms of quality. There are also some differences in certain film sequences, and it features an improved interface. That's about all you need to know about Night Trap then. The next best FMV game has to be Fahrenheit, which tasks players with stepping into the shoes of a firefighter. What makes this one interesting is the way in which it uses on-screen prompts to offer the player choice. In that sense, it feels more like you're exploring a virtual scene a la Myst or The Seventh Guest. It's still rather limited, sure, but it's kind of a step up from many other FMV titles of this era. It also features some of the highest quality video on the system, with playback that nearly fills the screen. As you can see, the difference in video quality between the two is even greater than in Night Trap. The expanded color palette absolutely transforms the game. It's a grainy mess on the Sega CD in comparison, but rather nice on 32X. This was a later title then, and the US version shipped with 2 discs, one for Sega CD and the other for 32X. You always have to put the first disc in first though before playing, as it acts as sort of a key disc for the 32X version. Next up then is Slam City with Scottie Pippen, and oh boy, this is something else.
Man, Figure holds the ball too long.
It's because he's posing for pictures.
It's full of 90s attitude that is oh so entertaining to watch. And it just shows how overly ambitious Digital Pictures was getting at this point. Trying to create a full-on basketball game using video is a crazy idea, and it almost works, but is ultimately kind of a lousy, unresponsive, and difficult to play game.
Man, I almost broke a sweat running points on you so fast.
If it were easier to play then, it might be good for a laugh, but it's just so frustrating. Amazingly, it ships on 4 CDs with each disc containing a single player. And as before, we see enhancements over the original release. Improved video playback and an enhanced interface all show up on the 32X. It follows the same trends as the previous games. The 4th game then is Corpse Killer, and man, this is one horrible game. It's basically a rail shooter of sorts, something that would work out okay in arcades later with games like Area 51, but it falls flat here. The video is choppy and the enemies look terrible as they sort of float towards the camera. And all of this is backed up with a rather unique story, to say the least.
Hi, Julie Barnes, journalist. Sure you read my stuff. Syndicated. But when I break this story, I'll have a book, late night talk shows, TV, the works.
And once again, we see those extra colors come into play on 32X, allowing for much improved video playback. Yep, those extra colors sure help bring these amazing actors to life. We're almost done now. How about Game 5 then, Supreme Warrior? If you thought basketball played with video was a bad idea, how about a fighting game? Supreme Warrior has to be the most frustrating fighting game in existence, and I use that term lightly. It basically devolves into a game of pressing the right button within a small window in order to trigger the correct video. Your hands and feet play little role in attacking, as damage only really occurs when you nail that window. And how about the 32X usage then? Yep, you guessed it, more colors and a modified interface. That's about it. And there's just one more game to mention that unfortunately I don't have access to, a 32X version of Surgical Strike. This is an ultra rare CD32X game that only released in Brazil. It looks like someone is working on getting a reprint out there, but as far as original copies go, this isn't something you're likely to run into. There aren't even any ISOs out there readily available for this one. Ah well. And that's all of the CD32X games. Exciting, right? Well, FMV was certainly hyped back in the day, but even at the time most of us realized that these types of games were just too limited to be fun. Of the bunch though, only Night Trap really sticks out for its unique security video approach to gameplay. It's still rather simplistic, sure, but it's a fun, cheesy sort of game. It's worth checking out, if nothing else, at least for the history lesson.
Get free, get free, get free.
Next up, we're looking at first-person mechanical combat games, of which there are two on the 32X. Sega's own Metalhead, and a conversion of the original arcade game, T-Mech. Let's start with Metalhead. Alongside Star Wars Arcade and Doom, Metalhead was one of those 32X games that was paraded around in magazines and commercials at the time. It's a first-person mech-based title that has players running through a city, destroying targets while taking orders from this handsome fellow.
Your first mission. Destroy all enemy mechs in the city near the border.
Let's be clear though, Metalhead is not a great game, but it is one that uses the 32X in interesting ways. Similar to Darkside, Metalhead makes use of fully texture-mapped 3D polygons. Buildings and mechs alike are fully textured and managed to look excellent for the system. Impressively, texture warping is kept to a reasonable level here, with a level of stability that feels competitive with other 3D systems of this era. The clipping plane is rather near the camera frustum, unfortunately resulting in noticeable pop-in, but Metalhead still manages to feel relatively advanced for its time. Performance, on the other hand, is a real problem here. The game hovers between 10 and 12 frames per second at pretty much all times, making for an experience that never feels fluid or fast. It's starting to encroach on Super FX chip territory here. It's one of the choppiest games on 32X by quite a wide margin. The game itself is dull as well, with super stiff controls and boring mission objectives that typically involve running around the same city, blasting brain-dead enemies. In terms of how it makes use of the Mega Drive hardware, well, the 16-bit machine renders the cockpit and the 2D background. That's basically it. Even this guy is handled by the 32X. Ultimately, Metalhead is an interesting little game, but not a whole lot of fun. It's definitely one of the more technically competent games on the system though, but it doesn't hold up. Okay, so what about the other mech game then? Well, I suppose it's more of a hover tank game really, a console conversion of T-Mech. Released in arcades back in 1994, T-Mech is essentially an updated take on the Battlezone formula, built using scaled sprites. In the arcades, machines were connected to allow for full-on multiplayer capabilities. It received two home ports, one for the 32X and the other for MS-DOS PCs. The 32X version stacks up reasonably well against the arcade. The resolution of everything is lower, and the frame rate isn't as stable, but it looks rather similar. The battlefield essentially consists of scaled bitmap images based on pre-rendered CGI. The basic setup is not unlike Sega's own superscalar games, lacking only in terms of art design. The sprites work reasonably well too when it comes to displaying a pseudo 3D environment. Of course, T-Mech also makes use of mesh transparency for explosions and the blue light, which is a step back from the arcade game. In comparison, the PC version is an upgrade over the 32X version, with visuals much more in line with the arcade game. It dishes the mesh transparencies used on 32X and generally runs smoother. Too fast on modern PCs actually. The Mega Drive is used here as well for the 2D background layer, as we've seen in many other games thus far. All in all, there just isn't a lot to say about T-Mech. It's a middle-of-the-road hover tank action game that makes reasonable use of the hardware and stands as one of 2 home conversions. Truth be told, I'm surprised that this one didn't make it to the Atari Jaguar instead. First up, we have NBA Jam Tournament Edition. Jam left a huge impression in the arcades in the early 90s by introducing fast-paced arcade-style basketball that appealed to even those that weren't into the sport. So how does NBA Jam fare on the 32X then? Well, not bad. You can see that the court graphics are lacking color compared to the arcade version, but the sprite work is relatively close. It's a nice looking conversion of the game. The main limitation here lies with the fact that the Mega Drive handles the courtside graphics. This is what allows for smooth 60 frames per second performance, but it also means that fewer colors are available. It's a similar situation as we saw with Mortal Kombat 2 then. Oh, and thanks to the shadows, it's actually still possible to play the game even without the 32X connected. So while it's true that the background graphics can appear somewhat grainy, it still ultimately manages to feel closer to the arcade game than, say, the Super NES version, which offers smaller sprites and less detailed overall visuals. Of course, the best version of NBA Jam, at least in my humble opinion, is the Sega Saturn conversion, which is basically arcade perfect save for a tiny bit of loading. The one area where the 32X kinda stumbles though is the audio. It just doesn't sound great and is a big step back from the arcade version. Still, you could do a lot worse than the 32X version of NBA Jam TE. That's actually pretty impressive for the Game Boy. Not bad. Okay, next up is FIFA Soccer 96. And this one is more interesting than you might expect. You see, for years, FIFA on consoles looked basically like this. An isometric style game with a rather low frame rate on both 16-bit machines. Though the Mega Drive does have a performance advantage here. Then in 1993, Electronic Arts unleashed FIFA International Soccer for the 3DO interactive multiplayer. And it was a revelation. It looks rough now, but this was the first time FIFA was displayed in full 3D on a console. Well, the players were still rendered using sprites, but still, this felt like a next level experience. And when you add in the awesome sound, it was genuinely impressive. When FIFA finally made its way to 32X then, it might have been easier just to bring the Mega Drive game over with more colors, but EA actually went the extra mile and created a fully 3D FIFA game for the system. It uses sprites like 3DO alongside a 3D stadium. It isn't quite as detailed as the 3DO version of course, but it still manages to hold up reasonably well. At least aside from the rather low frame rate, but these games were never known for great performance back in the day. It would of course be overshadowed quickly by subsequent games, but the 32X version of FIFA was an interesting milestone for the series. It was also likely the beginning of EA's distaste for Sega after their otherwise long, fruitful relationship. Next up then, baseball, and we're starting with RBI Baseball. The equivalent RBI games on the 16-bit machines look like this. But over on 32X, RBI Baseball features much larger character sprites and an increased color palette, at least while batting. Once the ball's in play though, the scrolling is jerky and the visuals are just grainy. It's a step down even from the Super NES version in that regard. So yeah, it's an interesting step forward in some ways, but it's ultimately nothing special. It does make use of the hardware for the expanded color palette, but really that's about it. It's also one of the cheapest games you can buy in the 32X, with carts coming in well under $20 most of the time, which I suppose is still a little pricey for an old sports game. But if you want to talk pricey in sports games, let me introduce you to World Series Baseball from Blue Sky. Yep, this is the same developer behind Spider-Man Web of Fire, and these games share more than just the developer. As I alluded to, yes, this is an expensive and rare game, one of the least common games for the system, and also one of those games that makes getting a complete collection rather difficult, since who wants to shell out hundreds of dollars for a sports game? Especially one like this. I feel that at a glance the game at least looks better than RBI Baseball, but suffers from many of the same visual issues, including choppy scrolling in the outfield. The art direction is superior and the color usage is better, but overall, it's not a great looking game. It does, however, make full use of the 32X hardware. If you look at just the Mega Drive layer, you basically get just some of the overlays and, well, the ball itself. Aside from that then, the rest of the visuals are handled by the 32X. Now, I'm not a huge fan of baseball games, mind you, but based on what I have played in the past, this definitely is not the kind of baseball game you want to invest in. It's slow-paced, difficult to hit the ball, and just not a lot of fun. The only reason to own this cartridge today is to complete your 32X collection. Good luck with that. Alright then, next up is Tough Man Contest, a one-on-one boxing game with a passing similarity to Nintendo's Super Punch-Out! It's a decent game, first released on the Mega Drive, but one that ultimately failed to gain traction, so an enhanced port was cooked up for the 32X. This is another EA Sports title, but unlike FIFA, this one shares a lot more with the original 16-bit release. The main improvement here comes from the background, which takes full advantage of the expanded color palette. It's brighter and less grainy than before, a huge improvement. On the other hand, all of the characters and sprites are handled by the Mega Drive hardware, but without having to worry about sharing its color palette with the background, the fighters are mildly improved, though perhaps not to the degree you might hope. Still, this isn't a bad little game. It's a reasonably enjoyable little boxing game that is worth a look since the 32X version is relatively cheap. But we still have one last game to go, NFL Quarterback Club. Yes, this is a game that hails from that mythical time when multiple football games were available to choose from. This was Acclaim's entry, and honestly, it's not terrible. Visually speaking, we're looking at a rather nice upgrade from the 16-bit version. On Mega Drive, the players and field lines float on top of a green background used to represent grass. The background uses line scrolling for perspective when moving left and right, but is otherwise disconnected from the lines, so it looks rather strange in action. On 32X then, the game uses a textured 3D field of sorts that moves properly with the camera. It looks a lot closer to what you would expect from a pseudo 3D football game. Like FIFA, both versions make use of sprites for players, but the animation and general fluidity of the game is a step up from Madden titles of the era. As you can see, it also makes use of 32X itself quite well, with very little displayed by the Mega Drive hardware. Ultimately, it's a football game for the 32X. What else do you need to know? Okay, let's wrap this up then.
And there it is. Every 32X game ever released in the bag. While this exercise in examining the system has certainly been time-consuming, it has been equally enlightening. This is a system with a deservedly bad reputation, but looking at the library as a whole, it's perhaps not quite the disaster you might think. There are some genuinely great games on the 32X. On the other hand, it's also clear that the hardware itself just wasn't strong enough to compete. It was ill-suited to handling 3D at a high frame rate, but also struggled with 2D bitmaps due to the lack of sprite hardware. In many ways, with its dual SH2s, the 32X is sort of an undercooked Sega Saturn. Still, it's not difficult to be fascinated by what was released. So, be sure to let us know which 32X games you found the most interesting here, and if you still own the system, be sure to share some photos of your collection over on Twitter. Let that 32X shine. As a quick PSA then, the next episode of DF Retro will be a little delayed, by a couple weeks at least, while I head off to Cologne to brave the crowds at Gamescom. Want to see what's coming in September though? Stick around to the end. Because that's all for now. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow me over on Twitter. I'm always eager for more suggestions for DF Retro. And until next time, stay retro. Coming to DF Retro this September.